the badge on the ground. The sun was setting on the sleepy town of Ridgewood, where time seemed to crawl and people didn't like change. Sheriff Paul Riggs had been in the force for 20 years, stubborn, proud, and known for his sharp tongue and outdated views. He walked through the precinct with a swagger, confident in his authority. The badge on his chest sparkled in the dimming sunlight like a symbol of his control. For most of his career, Riggs had maintained a reputation for keeping things in order, though everyone in town knew what that meant. He wasn't kind to outsiders, and he had a special disdain for anyone who didn't look like him. He made no secret of it. Some whispered he was stuck in the past, a man born in the wrong century. One day, as Riggs patrolled Central Avenue, a black woman named Naomi Harris walked down the street carrying a bag of groceries. Naomi had recently moved to Ridgewood from New York City, a place Riggs called a breeding ground for trouble. She was confident, intelligent, and knew how to stand her ground. "Hey, you," Riggs called out as he approached her. His voice was slow, deliberate, dripping with condescension. "We don't get many folks like you round here. You lost?" Naomi stopped, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He took a step closer. "We like things quiet here. Don't need outsiders stirring things up. You understand?" Naomi held her head high. "I live here now. Just bought a house on Elm Street. So no, I'm not lost." Riggs smirked. "Elm Street, huh? Must be nice. Bet it's real cozy. Let me guess, you're one of those types always looking for a handout, huh?" The insult hung in the air like thick smoke. Naomi clenched her fists, but she kept her voice calm. "Are you serious right now? All I'm doing is walking home. Last I checked, that's not a crime." But Riggs wasn't done. He leaned in, eyes gleaming with malice. "Listen, sweetheart. People around here? They know their place. You'd be smart to learn yours." Something inside Naomi snapped. Her calm exterior shattered, replaced by a wave of fury and determination. Without thinking twice, she reached out, grabbed the shiny badge on his chest, and ripped it off with a swift motion. For a split second, Riggs stood frozen, stunned by what had just happened. Naomi held the badge in her hand, her pulse racing. This little piece of metal is what makes you think you can treat people like dirt?" She shook her head, her voice steady and powerful. "Not today, Sheriff. Not with me." Before Riggs could react, Naomi threw the badge onto the ground, where it landed with a dull thud. A crowd had begun to gather, murmuring in disbelief. But then, something unexpected happened. A young boy in the crowd, Riggs' own nephew, spoke up. "Uncle Paul, that's not right." His words hit Riggs harder than Naomi's defiance. The sheriff turned, seeing his nephew's disappointed face. He suddenly felt every eye on him, not with admiration, but with judgment. For the first time in years, Riggs felt small. His chest tightened, and the weight of decades of arrogance pressed down on him. Naomi crossed her arms. "It's not too late to change," she said softly. "But first, you've got to take a hard look at who you are." Silence hung heavy. Then, Riggs bent down, picked up the badge, and stared at it. It no longer looked like a symbol of power, it looked like a burden. Without saying a word, he turned and walked back to his squad car. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring in surprise. Naomi stood tall, watching him go. As the sheriff sat behind the wheel, something shifted inside him. He wasn't ready to admit it, but Naomi's words stayed with him. Weeks later, Naomi was at the local coffee shop when Riggs walked in. This time, there was no smirk, no swagger. He walked up to her table, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost humble. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Depends. You gonna lecture me about knowing my place?" Riggs gave a small, awkward smile. "Actually, I was hoping you could tell me a thing or two about finding mine." Naomi stared at him for a moment, considering his words. It wasn't every day that a man like Sheriff Paul Riggs admitted he needed help, or that he was wrong. Part of her didn't trust him, not yet. But there was something different in his eyes this time, less arrogance, more vulnerability. "All right," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "But just so we're clear, this isn't about making me feel comfortable around you. It's about you facing some hard truths. You sure you're ready for that?" Riggs nodded, sitting down and wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Naomi leaned back in her chair, studying him. "So, where do we begin?" Over the next hour, they talked, cautiously at first, then more openly. Riggs shared stories from his childhood, growing up in a household where prejudice was taught at the dinner table. He admitted how those ideas had shaped him, how he never questioned them until now. Naomi listened carefully but didn't let him off the hook. "You might have been taught those things, but at some point, you made the choice to believe them. And worse, you enforced them." Riggs winced but nodded. "You're right. I did." "So, what's different now?" Naomi asked, crossing her arms. "Why should I believe you've changed?" Riggs paused, taking a deep breath. "Because, for the first time in my life, I feel ashamed. That day on the street, when you threw my badge on the ground, I felt something snap inside me. I've been thinking about it ever since. My nephew saw it, too. And when I looked at him, I realized I've been teaching him the same poison I was raised on. I don't want to be that man anymore." Naomi softened, just a little. She could tell he was sincere. But she also knew that words meant nothing without action. "All right," she said. "If you're serious, we're going to put that to the test." "Name it," Riggs said, determination flickering in his eyes. "First, you're going to start showing up at community meetings, especially the ones you've been ignoring. And not as a sheriff, just as Paul. Sit, listen, and don't say a word unless you're asked to. Second, I want you to spend time with the kids at the youth center. They need to see that the badge doesn't make you a monster. And third," she paused for emphasis, "when you screw up, and you will, you own it. No excuses, no hiding behind your badge." Riggs smiled wryly. "That all?" Naomi leaned forward. "That's just the start." Weeks turned into months, and to everyone's surprise, Riggs kept his word. He started attending community meetings, sitting quietly in the back at first, then eventually participating, not as an authority figure, but as a neighbor. At the youth center, he worked with the kids, helping with everything from basketball practice to math tutoring. It wasn't easy, most of them didn't trust him at first. But slowly, they began to warm up to him. There were setbacks, of course. Old habits die hard, and there were moments when Riggs slipped, his temper flaring, his defensive walls going back up. But each time, Naomi was there to call him out, and each time, Riggs faced it head-on. One day, during a particularly heated community meeting, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins stood up and addressed Riggs directly. "Sheriff, I've lived in this town for 60 years. I've seen men like you come and go, and I've never believed any of them could change. But you're proving me wrong." The room fell silent. Riggs, visibly moved, cleared his throat. "I've got a long way to go, Mrs. Jenkins. But I'm trying. By the time spring rolled around, Ridgewood wasn't the same town it had been. Change was slow, but it was happening. And at the heart of it all was an unlikely partnership, Naomi and Riggs, two people who couldn't have been more different, yet who had become unexpected allies. One afternoon, Riggs found himself back on Central Avenue, walking the same path where it had all begun. This time, when he saw Naomi carrying her groceries, he didn't call out with a snide remark. Instead, he jogged over to her. "Need a hand?" he asked with a grin. Naomi laughed. "Only if you promise not to make me regret it." Riggs chuckled. "No promises. But I'll try my best." And with that, they walked down the street together, two people who had found a way to bridge the widest of divides, proving that change is possible, even in the most unlikely of places. The two walked side by side down Central Avenue, the late afternoon sun painting the streets in a golden hue. For the first time in a long while, Riggs felt something strange: peace. He wasn't the man he used to be, and the badge on his chest didn't feel like a shield anymore. It felt more like a promise. As they reached Naomi's house, she set her grocery bag on the porch and turned to him. "You're getting better at this whole being a decent human thing, Sheriff." Riggs laughed. "High praise coming from you." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Honestly, I've learned more from you in 6 months than I did in 20 years on the force." Naomi smiled, but her eyes held a serious glint. "Good. Because you're not done yet. The real work is just starting." "I know," Riggs said, nodding. "But I've got some ideas." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Oh. Like what?" Riggs leaned against the porch railing. "Community policing. Real community policing. Not the kind where we just roll in when there's trouble, but the kind where we're part of the community, every day, not just when things go wrong. I'm thinking of setting up a town hall to get input from everyone. No uniforms, no speeches, just honest conversations. We need to rebuild trust, and it has to start with listening." Naomi crossed her arms, impressed. "Now that's an idea worth hearing. But you're gonna need help." Riggs chuckled. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'd like you to help lead it with me. We'll make it happen together." Naomi's eyes narrowed in mock suspicion. "You sure you're ready to take orders from me?" Riggs smirked. "Haven't I been doing that for months already?" The town hall was scheduled for the following month. Word spread quickly, and by the time the night of the event arrived, the old Ridgewood Community Center was packed. People from all walks of life filled the seats, young and old, longtime residents and newcomers, skeptics and hopefuls alike. Naomi and Riggs stood at the front of the room. Riggs cleared his throat, feeling a familiar flutter of nerves, but this time it wasn't fear of being judged. It was the weight of responsibility. "Thank you all for coming," Riggs began, his voice steady but humble. "I'm not gonna give a long speech tonight. You've heard enough from me over the years. This time, I'm here to listen. I've made mistakes, big ones, and I'm not proud of the man I used to be. But I'm trying to be better. And I want to do that with all of you." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then Naomi stepped forward. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Tonight, we're not just talking about what's wrong. We're talking about how we can fix it, together." One by one, people began to speak, sharing stories of struggles, frustration, and hope. Some voiced their anger at past injustices, while others shared ideas for building a better future. Riggs listened to every word, taking notes, nodding in understanding. As the night went on, something remarkable began to happen. The barriers that had divided the town for years started to crack. Weeks later, Ridgewood was buzzing with change. The youth center expanded its programs with Riggs' support, offering new opportunities for kids. Local businesses started hiring more diverse staff. And Riggs began working with neighboring towns to build similar community-focused initiatives. But not everything was easy. There were still people who doubted Riggs' transformation, and not everyone welcomed the changes with open arms. Naomi reminded him constantly, "This isn't a sprint, Sheriff. It's a marathon." One evening, Riggs stood outside the precinct, looking up at the Ridgewood Police Department sign. Naomi joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Deep in thought?" "Yeah," Riggs said, taking a sip. "Just thinking about how far we've come, and how much more there is to do." Naomi nodded. "We'll get there. One step at a time." For the first time in his life, Riggs believed her. "You know," he said with a grin, "I was wrong about one thing." "Just one?" Naomi teased. "Okay, maybe a few," Riggs chuckled. "But I'm glad you threw my badge on the ground that day. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." Naomi smiled, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "Here's to second chances." "To second chances," Riggs echoed. As they stood there, the lights of Ridgewood twinkling around them, it was clear that the town, and its people, were finally ready to move forward, together. The trouble ahead. The weeks that followed were some of the most promising Ridgewood had seen in years. The sheriff's department launched new community outreach programs, Riggs became a familiar face at local schools and events, and Naomi continued to work tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. But not everyone was happy with the changes. A group of rigid traditionalists, led by a man named Frank Dillard, began pushing back. Frank was an old friend of Riggs, a former deputy, retired now, but still wielding influence among Ridgewood's older residents. He believed the town was losing its roots, and he didn't hesitate to let Riggs know it. "You're making a mistake, Paul," Frank said one evening as they sat on the steps outside the sheriff's office. "This town doesn't need all these reforms. What it needs is order, the way we used to do things." Riggs glanced at Frank, his jaw tightening. "The way we used to do things hurt a lot of people, Frank. I'm not going back to that." "People don't want change," Frank insisted. "They want to feel safe. And all this community policing nonsense? It's just gonna bring trouble. Safety isn't about control. It's about trust," Riggs said, standing. "We've lost that trust, and I'm working to get it back. You're either with me, or you're in the way." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Paul. You're turning your back on the people who made you." "Maybe it's time I do," Riggs replied, walking back into his office without looking back. A few nights later, trouble found its way back to Ridgewood. A fire broke out at the youth center, just after closing hours. The building was empty, but the damage was extensive. By the time firefighters arrived, most of the interior was destroyed. Naomi stood in front of the smoldering wreckage, her heart sinking. She knew the youth center had its share of enemies, people who didn't want to see progress, who feared change. Riggs arrived moments later, his face grim. "Arson," he said, inspecting the scene. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Naomi crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. "We're not going to let them scare us back into the past." "Agreed," Riggs said. "We'll find out who did this." But even as he said it, he felt a twinge of doubt. Whoever had set that fire wasn't just trying to destroy a building, they were sending a message. The investigation. The next few days were tense. Riggs assigned his best detectives to investigate the fire, but leads were scarce. Whoever had done it had covered their tracks well. Meanwhile, the town grew divided. Some residents were outraged by the attack, demanding justice. Others, quietly or not so quietly, whispered that the youth center had brought it on itself. One afternoon, Naomi received an anonymous note slipped under her door. It read, "Go back to where you came from. This isn't your fight." Her hands trembled as she read it. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of determination. She walked straight to the sheriff's office, slamming the note down on Riggs' desk. "This is what we're up against," she said. "They think they can scare me. They think they can scare us." Riggs picked up the note, his face darkening. "They have no idea who they're messing with." The breaking point. A few days later, Riggs got a tip. A local teenager named Mikey Douglas had been bragging about knowing who set the fire. Riggs found him at a skate park on the edge of town. "Mikey," Riggs said, standing over him. "We need to talk." The teenager shrugged, trying to act cool. "About what?" "The fire at the youth center. I hear you know something about it." Mikey's eyes darted nervously. "I don't know anything." "Listen, kid," Riggs said, crouching to meet his eye. "You've got two choices: help us out, or get caught in the middle when things go bad. Trust me, you don't want the second option." Mikey hesitated, then sighed. "It wasn't me, I swear. But I heard Frank Dillard talking about teaching Naomi a lesson. He didn't say it was him, but you know how he is." Riggs felt his stomach drop. Frank. Of course. The confrontation. That night, Riggs drove to Frank's house. The porch light was on, and Frank was sitting in a rocking chair, sipping a glass of whiskey. "Evening, Paul," Frank said, smiling. "Something on your mind?" Riggs stepped onto the porch, his eyes cold. "I know it was you, Frank. The youth center fire. The threats. All of it." Frank chuckled. "Careful with your accusations, Sheriff. You wouldn't want to slander an upstanding citizen." "Cut the crap," Riggs snapped. "This ends now. You're going to confess, or I'll make sure every investigator in the county is breathing down your neck until we find the evidence that puts you away." Frank leaned forward, his smile fading. "You've changed, Paul. I thought you were one of us." "I was," Riggs said. "And it was the worst mistake of my life." Frank stood, his face inches from Riggs. "You'll regret this." Riggs didn't flinch. "The only thing I regret is not standing up to you sooner." The next morning, Frank was arrested. The investigation uncovered enough evidence to link him to the fire, along with a network of others who had been trying to sabotage the community's progress. Naomi watched as the news spread through the town. Some were shocked, others were relieved. But one thing was clear: Ridgewood was finally ready to move forward, without the shadows of its past holding it back. As Riggs walked into the youth center's temporary office, Naomi smiled at him. "We won," she said. "For now," Riggs replied. "But we've got more work to do." "Always," Naomi said, raising her coffee in a toast. And this time, Riggs knew they wouldn't just survive the fight, they'd win it, together. The road to healing. In the weeks that followed Frank Dillard's arrest, Ridgewood began a new chapter. The investigation revealed a web of conspirators, former law enforcement officers, local business owners, and others who had long thrived in the shadows, working to maintain control through fear and intimidation. The trial became a public spectacle, exposing the ugly truths that had lingered beneath the surface for years. Frank refused to go down quietly. In court, he painted himself as a patriot protecting the town from outsiders and radicals. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified against him, including Mikey Douglas, who finally found the courage to speak. Naomi sat in the front row every day, her presence a silent but powerful reminder of why the fight mattered. Riggs testified too, confessing his own past complicity in Ridgewood's old ways and owning up to the mistakes he had made. It wasn't easy. Some called him a traitor. Others claimed he was turning Ridgewood into something unrecognizable. But more people, especially the younger generation, stood behind him. For the first time, they saw a sheriff who wasn't just enforcing the law but actively trying to change it for the better. A town reborn. By summer, the youth center had been rebuilt, bigger and better than before. Naomi helped design the new space, a bright, welcoming building with classrooms, a gym, and a community kitchen. The kids returned in droves, more excited than ever. Riggs kept his promise to remain involved. Every Friday, he volunteered at the center, helping with everything from homework to basketball games. He wasn't just Sheriff Riggs anymore, he was Paul, the guy who showed up, listened, and never stopped trying to be better. The community meetings continued, growing larger and more productive with each session. Programs were launched to support local businesses, provide job training for teens, and foster open dialogue between police and residents. But not everything was perfect. There were still moments of tension, still people who resisted the change. Naomi and Riggs had plenty of late-night arguments, disagreements on how to handle certain issues. But the difference now was that they both knew how to listen and how to compromise. 1 year later. On the anniversary of the youth center fire, the town held a celebration. The streets were filled with music, laughter, and food from every corner of the community. Naomi stood on the main stage, addressing the crowd. A year ago, we almost lost something precious. But instead of letting fear tear us apart, we came together. We rebuilt. We learned. And we grew. This isn't the end of our journey, it's just the beginning. The crowd erupted in applause. Naomi smiled and stepped aside, gesturing for Riggs to join her. He looked at the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm not much for speeches," Riggs said with a grin, "but I'll say this, thank you for giving me a second chance. For believing we could be better. We've still got a long road ahead, but if we walk it together, there's nothing we can't do." The crowd cheered, and for the first time in his life, Riggs felt truly at home in Ridgewood. The conclusion. That night, as Naomi and Riggs sat on the steps of the rebuilt youth center, watching the last of the partygoers drift home, Naomi glanced at him. "You know, a year ago, I never would have imagined we'd be here." Riggs chuckled. "A year ago, I was an entirely different person." "True," Naomi said with a teasing smile. "But it turns out even old dogs can learn new tricks." They sat in silence for a moment, the warm summer breeze carrying the sounds of laughter and music in the distance. "So, what's next?" Riggs asked. Naomi sipped her coffee. "We keep going. We keep pushing. Because the fight never really ends, it just changes." Riggs nodded. "Good thing I've got you to keep me in line." "Always," Naomi said, bumping his shoulder with hers. "You're stuck with me now." And as the lights of Ridgewood twinkled around them, they knew that the town, like its people, had finally found its way towards something better. Not perfect, but stronger. Not without scars, but still standing. Together.